If Salesforce adoption feels harder than it should be, the problem may not be your data model, automation, or integrations. It might be your user interface. In this episode of Serious Talk, we unpack why UI is one of the most underestimated drivers of adoption, data quality, and operational efficiency. I'm Greg Banks, and today I'm joined by Allie Nelson and Al Huerta as we break down the real difference between UI and UX in Salesforce, the hidden risks of ignoring interface design, and how small intentional UI decisions could dramatically improve user behavior. Thanks for coming along with us. Whether you're a business leader evaluating your Salesforce ROI or a technical team responsible for building scalable, governed solutions, this conversation will give you practical insights you can apply immediately. Thanks for coming along. Let's jump right in. All right. Welcome back, Al and Allie, to Salesforce at Scale. Good to have you both here today.
Absolutely.
Hello.
All right. Today's topic. Allie, I know this is one of your favorites. I think you just did a webinar on this. UI. I think there's some misnomers about it out in the ecosystem. So before we get anything into why it's so important and how to make it better and things not to do, let's start out by defining UI.
Yeah. So UI stands for user interface, and user interface, especially in the Salesforce world, is really going to be the pages that people are looking at and the way that they interact with the system. So it means the layout of how our pages are structured. It means the navigation of getting where they need to be in the system. And it can also be components such as actions, buttons, etc. I think it's really important to talk about UI in the context of what's called UX or user experience, because sometimes the two can be conflated a little bit. And UI is the actual, logistics of the interface itself. It's a narrower piece of the overall user experience of interacting with Salesforce. So while a UI is going to be limited to many of the tools that for us live in the Object Manager and in Lightning App Builder, overall user experience, or UX, is really going to be defined as the sum total of all of the different things that make up a user's experience using Salesforce. That's going to be things like, hey, how are they logging in and how are they getting there compared to other tools they might be using? It's going to be what training have they received and do they have the support for when they have questions? It's going to be how do they communicate about, their customers and communicate about maybe customer cases if they're working in Service Cloud, and the things that they do that oscillate around Salesforce just as much as it is the system itself. So I know today we're going to be looking at talking about UI specifically, but it's important to know that UI is a really important part of UX.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably no one in our audience will have problems relating to this, that you sat down and, half the programs I've got single sign-on, which means if I'm in the office or I'm on VPN, I open the app, I click the link, and I'm there, and it's great. And then one day that doesn't work and you ask me to remember a password and I got to go find my sticky note. So we've all been down that rabbit trail and understand the importance of that. So if it's hard to get in, right, you're working from a deficit right out of the gate. So, but once you're in the platform, from how the screen is laid out, just some things in the last 3 or 4 years that have made things better is doing screen flows. It seemed like for all the years I was training people, I would have to go create an account, save it, and then go create a new contact on that account and save it, and then create an opportunity and save it, where now you can do all that in one flow and tie it together, where it's a lot more autonomous process for the user. And, if I don't have to scroll and I don't have to click, I can just type the things and be done. You have a fan. So we've all seen variations of this, but what are some examples of good UI, and maybe what are some examples of bad UI?
Boy, we probably have a lot of examples of.
And we don't have an hour, I should say that.
I think some examples of a clear example, especially when we're talking about screen flows for me, is going to be the difference between multiple explicit buttons versus one universal button. And what I mean by that is often I will see people creating screen flows that do similar things for different users, maybe different departments, and they create a button for each. So if I'm a user and I need to go use the screen flow, I have to go find the button that's relevant to me. Something that we've done in the past is we change that where we create one screen flow that first, when it's launched, it makes a decision. Which user is interacting? And then based on that decision, let's give them a different experience within one singular button so that users don't have to make decisions around it. Kind of remove that user decision piece. But Al, what about you?
Yeah, I would say that when we're implementing for customers, one of the first things we look at is how do we increase usability quickly out of the gate? And typically, it's as simple as just removing things that people don't need access to. One of the things with a platform like Salesforce that's enterprise, that has tons of functionality, so many legacy features, is that you have a lot of things on a page that people will never use in one org or another. The use cases are so different. So the first thing we like to do is go and strip things out, make things as simplistic as possible. It's easy to add things in, but when people get used to one layout and you start taking things away, it's a little bit confusing. So I think right out of the gate, simpler is better and less is more when it comes to the way that we design user interfaces, especially with a system like Salesforce.
Yeah, great call. And I won't open Pandora's box other than to mention that it exists. And another one where it relates, we do a lot of field service here at Sirius. When you think about people being in the field, they're usually on a mobile device, i.e., a tablet or a cell phone. And when I'm in the office and I've got my 39-inch curved monitor, I don't mind 50 extra fields as long as they're out of the way and I don't have to deal with them. I probably don't have to scroll, but you throw that into a mobile phone. By the time I scroll far enough to find what I was looking for, I forgot why I went there. So mobile is another, I think it's one of those things that gets set on the back burner. Like we got to know what the system should do before we optimize it for mobile. But if it's something you don't have budget and time and a resource to kind of really allocate what is important to somebody in the field, right? They're either looking something up or really quickly wanting to update something. They're generally not in the field sitting in the car doing mass amounts of data entry. So that's a really, really key point to getting rid of things that don't matter. In mobile, you would do an awful lot of that. It's a really optimal place.
Absolutely.
Between the three of us, I don't know how many years of experience. We should add that up at some point, but we've had probably upwards of 100 customer interactions over the years of different projects. And every client's a little different. Every org's a little different. We certainly have seen clients who prioritize dealing with technical debt, which we talked about last week, and dealing with making sure one of the key elements of every initiative is having good UI. We certainly have clients who've not gotten around to some of that. What are some of the detriments that an org would experience if you're not dealing with this head on?
I think if you're not prioritizing and optimizing UI, then you might build things like screen flows, different, what people kind of call wizards, to walk people through a process. But if you're not cleaning up all of the different avenues that a person can take to actually reach an endpoint, you're building guardrails with no ability to enforce them. So something as simple as having a new button lurking on a page for a new account, when you have a process that creates a new account through a screen flow, suddenly you built a go around that people will start leveraging that now does not invoke any of your automation and does not result in the kind of data you're looking for. So it's a silly thing, but you might put a lot of effort in and then not actually get any payoff because you're not closing off all the different routes. So there really is a in-depth process that you need to take to look at the entire system holistically, understand all the different entry points for data creation, and strategically block off any of them that will not result in what you're looking for.
I would say also talk to the users because often I will design something that I feel is great. It feels airtight. And then I'll sit down with the user and they will show me a way they're doing something that I never imagined somebody could find. So just taking the time to go and sit with a team for an hour and just watch how they're working, watch how they're using the system, see where they're frustrated. Man, it pays off.
Yeah, certainly. I can't overstate how important it is to sit in the mind of or the cube of the user to see what it is they're facing. Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about coming into this episode, but is it a fair statement to say not addressing UI challenges can in some ways contribute to creating technical debt? That new button example, I didn't do anything to create that. When I enabled the object, it probably threw it on the page for me. But if it's detrimental to the optimal process that we have designed by not addressing that, I've now created technical debt that's going to be a question generator for every future user. Which one should I do? And if people don't know what to do, they're going to do what they know. Everybody knows what a new button means. And when in doubt, they're going to click it, which is going to result either in poor data quality downstream, where like maybe they put everything on the page, but it didn't link to the right record. So it's going to lead to real poor data quality, which is going against the core purpose of having a powerful platform like Salesforce. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. I think also when we think about how technical debt can snowball, especially with respect to user interface, What can happen there is when users are not sure the right way to do something, or when there are multiple avenues, you're going to start to see more requests coming in from teams that help them do things. Because if people are confused, that leads to frustration. And when people are frustrated, it leads people to want to find solutions. And then you've got teams requesting those solutions when there might be one already existing. And especially if you don't have a really tight process for defining that, you might have a lot of extra stuff hanging out that you do not want out there.
Yeah, by how you define this at the beginning, Allie, to have a good design process, to have a good testing process, should lead to good documentation, which should lead to good training. And if you've done all those things in that order, when you launch a process, you got everybody aiming in the same direction with the same knowledge base, right? Everybody's not going to remember the same amount of stuff, but they're all aiming at the same thing. If you miss any one of those, then you're going to find yourself in a mess where 3 people are going one way and the 4th is going another. And somewhere down there, as Murphy says, the new person is going to get trained by the person not following the process. That's just how it seems to happen. So having a good culture set up around making sure, that's a priority of every initiative. If you're doing a new launch or a new build or a brand new org setup, obviously that's really important. But one of the things that I tried to do when I owned an org, I tried to do this every December. It's when we address with technical debt. It's when we tackle UI stuff. Like we would carve out a section of the system when we would go top to bottom through all of it and make a list of all the stuff we wanted to clean up. We would start in June saying, start building your list. And then by October, we would start voting on what were most important to my largest user population. And then in December, we cleaned all that up, updated documentation. So when people came back in January, they were facing an optimized system that had been improved. If there's any one thing that brings value in the eye of the user is when their experience gets better. Right? Yes. At the end of the day, we're all doing our job in this thing, but if you do something to make my job better, again, you've got a fan.
Absolutely. And it's funny with user interface in particular, because it's so high visibility and because people come to depend on where things are, when you move a field on a page layout, that can have massive effects. People might, assume that, well, I don't see it there, so it's just gone now. So there is a lot of change management that has to go behind any kind of UI optimizations, especially if it's for maybe a layout that's been in use for a long time and you have long-time employees that are used to doing things in a very particular way. It's a process that really does need a lot of thought behind it, how you roll those things out and how you inform individuals that, what they see is not going to necessarily be the same, but things are, hopefully better and everything they need is still there and available.
Yeah, great call. And I will say this is an area in the last couple of years that Salesforce has made a lot of improvements on. When Lightning came out, it wasn't classic repainted. It was arguably completely different. In fact, a lot of functionality got lost when they went to Lightning. But when they came out with the ability to do dynamic pages, and they've enhanced that so much further. One of the things that was available back in 1980 in C# was I could pick this and have an entire section of a screen appear and disappear depending on the value that I picked. That wasn't available outside of Visualforce and Salesforce for 20 years. But things like that arguably make for a much more optimized experience. It encapsulates a lot of what you've already talked about. I've got a bunch of fields on the screen I don't need until I do. I don't need a whole nother screen or hit save and let the record type change and a new page layout. All these things you had to do 5 years ago, you don't have to do anymore. So this is I guess somewhat of an argument or set up for a future episode about making sure you're keeping up release notes and what the latest features are, because that is an area where they've made improvements. And it's probably one of the greatest single things you can do to increase adoption is for your users to have an optimal experience here.
Absolutely. No, I was just going to say, I definitely agree. I think a lot of businesses especially are always reluctant to invest time in UI. And, it feels like something that can be an afterthought. I think a lot of companies disregard it as, it's just the look and feel. It's not the core functionality, but the functionality is the adoption. If people are not using it and don't like using it and are frustrated, then you're not going to get the benefit of any of the other things that you've built in the system either.
We talked a lot here about page layouts, because that's arguably where you spend a lot of your time. But what are some other things in the platform that you would say are very UI critical?
Well, I want to call out one area that I think a lot of customers are just starting to really understand the importance of, and that's making a record page a hub for all the related activities that might, be tied to that record. So for example, if you have an opportunity that represents your sale, you have a whole downstream fulfillment process. And with the, the capability of Lightning Web Components and how much easier they're getting to build, we can start to centralize a lot of related activities and downstream activities onto one core page to reduce the amount of clicking around, the amount of extra windows or tabs that need to be open, and make one record page a hub that ties into everything else that's related downstream. And that could be at the downstream area too. You see everything that was related upstream. And the idea ultimately is to kind of centralize all aspects of a process on one page and have a user not need to navigate at all to see anything that's related to what they're looking at. And I think that's really what Salesforce is going for as well. As I was reading recently about their new Agentforce pages, where they're going to be dynamic based on what actions you're taking. A page layout can actually dynamically change and render different information that it sees is vital at that time based on all the different criteria of what you're looking at. So it seems like that's really where things are ultimately heading, is not necessarily a bunch of page layouts for different objects, but more of a hub that ties a lot of disparate information together into one central location to reduce the need to navigate it all.
That's a really critical point. I think is back office folks, as IT folks, technical folks, whatever you want to call us. We sit in the back and we hear user requirements and we build these things. We make all the right connections, but we're building something that represents the totality of a process for a company. Now, at any given company that's big enough to have a process probably has more than one people group contributing to the life of that record or that process, whatever that may be. And most times, no one person knows all the things upstream or downstream of them, or very, very few people do. So somebody gets the cog and they do a little thing to it and they send it down the line and somebody else does a little thing to it. And I bring all this up for a reason, and that is the user is just going to touch the thing they didn't know about. They shouldn't have to know all the up and downstream things. All those connections need to be made. So when you talk about a hub, right? I mean, this goes back to, you think we had Rolodexes back in the day, right? You had a card for every person. There was no way to group by company. You had to sort alphabetically. Otherwise, your OCD would get out of whack, right? That's how you'd sort it to make it make sense. But when we got databases, now I can group things. And I used to call these the toddler meetings where I come from. At the end of the year, the bean counters come to the business leaders and they look at what the revenue looked like for that year. And they go, why? Why? Well, that led to this sale. But why? Well, that came from this lead. Well, why? Well, that lead went from that campaign, right? They want the breadcrumb trail of how all those things went through and the why. No individual user is going to get called to testify and go, well, I did this lead on this day because blank, right? Your platform, your operation should, as I do my little piece, it's adding the breadcrumbs as you go. So at the end of the thing, the whole thing makes sense to tell that story. The story is written as you're doing your part of it. A poor UI is going to allow you to create that data, not be tied together. So you can't have the hub. You're going to wind up with fields that don't matter and broken up data that can't be connected or reported on. And you're just not going to go back and be able to pull that story out of that if the data is not connected. So it's not just making the user happy. This ultimately will contribute to data quality, which will be a very important bottom line on your ROI of your investment. Is there anything else platform-wise outside of the Lightning Web Component that you think about when we say UI?
I mean, I think it's even in things like how we structure reports and dashboards, how we organize information there. It's really anything that somebody is looking at and using to interact with Salesforce. So, when we say Lightning pages, we don't just mean a record page. We mean home pages. We mean app pages. The components they're in. It can even mean things like your experience sites. So if you've got folks who are partners, contractors, and customers logging in, it's thinking about this not only for your internal teams interacting with individual records, but also anybody who's touching your system and looking at information there.
Absolutely. And I think on the further end of the spectrum, things that I dealt with a good bit. We had several people that were partially blind or were colorblind.
Mhm.
I had the system for 4 or 5 years before they told me, well, I can't read this dashboard. All the colors look the same to me. I said, what do you mean? There's red, there's blue, there's green. They all look gray to me. That'd have been good to know. So there are some accessibility features
There
that
are.
are built into Salesforce. Like there's a process to do it, but the methodology is there and it's not hard to deal with. But it's a question that I would say, unless the person developing user stories either has their own disability of some kind or has somebody in their family, is they're not going to think to ask it. So it's definitely something really high on the importance scale of a larger corporation, because the odds are you've got somebody that, or more than one, that's going to deal with that. And you want to make sure you address that head on. Don't make them be the squeaky wheel that comes up 5 years later and brings it up.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people also, similarly to just writing off UI as look feel. A lot of people are like, hey, we don't really need to think about accessibility. We don't have anyone in our company who needs it. But it's a rising tide lifts all boats. If you make something more accessible for folks who do need it, it's going to be a better experience for all. So thinking about how we organize information on that Lightning page, if we optimize it for someone who uses a screen reader, well, chances are it's going to be better organized for folks who don't use a screen reader and who just use our eyeballs. So I think that there's a lot to be said for learning how to make that design a little bit more inclusive, because ultimately it's just going to serve everyone a little bit better.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody regret taking a little extra time to optimize it that way. So, any other things jump out to you? What about like your tabs or the apps that a user picks from? I've been in orgs where you logged in and like everybody wasn't an admin, but everybody effectively had the same access. They all saw the same apps. They all used the same record types. Everybody had full create rights. What are some of
Yeah.
those things that jump out to you?
I mean, this kind of goes a little bit back to accessibility and ergonomics, where if your eyes are constantly having to search for what they're looking for, it causes eye strain over time. It makes it literally more frustrating and more difficult for your brain, to the point of over time, it can actually be harmful to you. And so, yes, users have access to a ton of apps out of the box, but it's very easy to streamline those and give an experience where people don't have to make those decisions. Because every time somebody's brain goes to that app launcher and has to, parse through and find the one they're looking for, that little second of time adds up. And you'll find that you have probably a lot of seconds of time that people are just spending looking for stuff. It's the same reason that we recommend putting your information in tabs on your Lightning pages instead of having people scroll through a ton of things that are stacked one on top of each other, because that time adds up. I'd rather your users be able to spend their time providing that value directly to customers and working with your customers, as opposed to frustratingly poking around and trying to find what they need.
And you mentioned time just in terms of how long it takes somebody to find something. But the reality is if it's all on one page and it's all trying to load, that's actually physically going to be slower. It's going to put more burden on the system to grab all that data and service it up. Or if you have it on tabs, those tabs won't necessarily load until you view them. So you may have a slight delay when you do go view that tab, as opposed to having a delay every single time if you had it all on one page. So yeah, those are really easy things to do in today's UI that make a really big impact, not just on how it looks to the person, but how long it's going to take them to load it anyway. Any closing thoughts on this one? This is a topic you go a lot of ways with, but I think everybody relates to the pain. It's the approach of cutting at it and trying to start work on it. That's probably a tutorial we could do on a separate episode at some point. Like where do you start with this? And it is, you just got to take a first step, right? You got to get in there, open a page, get a governing body that's got optimism in mind, that has a voice of power that can make those decisions. That's going to lead to more training on the back end to make sure everybody's aware of those changes coming. Not where did my fields go? And I think particularly when a client migrates from something into Salesforce, the temptation is to bring everything that you had before, because it looks familiar and people acclimate when they feel like this is something that's familiar. That's fine for go live, but you could do little things like, let's make it read only, where they look at it and they go, I can't change this information. It's here for a short time, 90, 120 days out. All those fields are going to get taken off the page layout. 6 months later, every field gets deleted and that stuff just goes away. It was there for a purpose to get us migrated over, but long term, it doesn't serve any value to the company. So just little things like that, you can make conscious decisions on the front end. Maybe you have to do hard things on the beginning to get people on the platform, but you need to have real intentional steps played out on the calendar. And to Allie's point, you got to make this a priority. It's not the sexiest thing out there. It probably is the most exciting one for your users, though. And if they're not happy, nobody who uses it's going to be, because the data quality is just not going to be there.
Yeah. And this has direct impacts to efficiency of your operations. So it is important. One thing I think you brought up that's really vital, Greg, and this was a thread from the last session we had as well. It's all about governance. It's about strategy. It's about thinking through these things and being intentional, and not just, making any optimization anybody has an idea about in the system. It needs to go through some kind of a body that makes the call. And then we do training behind that. We do change management behind that. And that's how you make sure that you actually build a process that's set to last and doesn't need to be reworked in whole every few years.
Agreed. And if you're looking at across your org and you're aware of this blinking red light that's in the mirror, it's coming. I know I got to deal with it and I just don't know where to go. That's what we're here for, right? If this is not something you do every day, you probably can fumble your way through getting rid of fields and some of those things, but it may be a little frustrating to you if you're not used to how you might address some of these problems. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd be glad to have a high-level conversation with you just to see where you are on it and then determine the best course of action from there. But Allie and Al, appreciate your time today. This is a fun topic to talk about because I know at the end of the day, we all want happy users. We all do. That nobody benefits when users are not happy. And there's probably no simpler, better way to address it than optimizing the UI. So thank you guys for your time. We'll have details in some show notes about this topic, but we'll look forward to catching you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks again for spending time with us on Serious Talk. If today's conversation helped you rethink how UI impacts adoption, efficiency, and data quality, we'd love for you to share this episode with business leaders or Salesforce teams who are struggling. Be sure to follow or subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. And if you have a moment, please leave a review. It helps others find the podcast and helps us adjust the content for your liking. You'll find links and recommended resources in the show notes, including content that expands on UI optimization, governance, and scalable Salesforce design. And if you have questions or want to continue the conversation, please reach out to us anytime at SeriousTalk@SeriousSolutions.com. Finally, a special thank you to Jason Fowler for allowing us to use his song Mystery Road as part of the show. Until next time, keep building systems your users actually want to use.